Hi, you guys. I'm going to give you a little walkthrough of what our topic for week 5 is. And yes, I know that we're already past week 5. I'm a little bit behind here, but this is really important stuff. So, what I wanted to do this week is, this whole time we've really been focusing on your camera, and I know that some of the exercises that you've had to do have been a little bit tedious or difficult, and I hope you understand why now after doing them. Hopefully you're a lot more comfortable with your camera. So now we're actually going to start having a little bit more fun, and this, or at least what I think is fun. This time around, we need to start talking about what our pictures look like, and how to make a good, well composed, well balanced picture. Um, I think composition is absolutely the most important thing. And by composition, I mean how everything you see in the frame is arranged and how it all relates to each other. What we have to have is something called unity, which means that everything seems to be exactly where it needs to be, and it works well with everything else, and it just looks good. It just flows. And so I'm going to give you some exercises to do where you can try out different compositional techniques. And so I've got the rule of thirds. I think I've already talked to you about this a little bit before. I've got quite a few. I've got quite a few things for you guys to look at, and it's some reading assignments here. A lot of it's kind of redundant, but so I wanted to use rule of thirds, talk about making the choice between a horizontal or a vertical format, paying attention to where your where you are in relation to your subject, because if you move, of course the subject and everything else moves in your frame. um, I need to put the word focal point in there. A focal point is like an area of emphasis, like your most important area. So I also want to talk about balance, which has to do with how things appear in your image. Um, we regard things as having a certain amount of visual weight. Of course, it doesn't actually weigh anything, but you can look at something in a frame, in a composition, and it's going to feel or look heavier or lighter than something else. And I think after you look at these articles here, um, you'll understand it a little bit better. So I'm just going to open these up and see if there were any pictures I wanted to point out to you. Rule of thirds. Okay, this is just almost guarantees a good picture. It's it's not necessarily the only rule. It doesn't have to be the only way that you do things, but for the most part, when we look at an image, we superimpose a little tic-tac-toe grid over over the frame, and we can break this area up, this space up into thirds horizontally and vertically. Generally, what we can do to get a nice composition is think about where we place our focal point. And I think a lot of people who are just starting out think their focal point, which of course is the area of main emphasis, needs to be right in the middle. It certainly can be in certain situations, but as a general rule of thumb, no, you don't want that. Choose one of those 4 points on your little tic-tac-toe grid where you place your subject, and I can assure you you're going to get a more pleasing composition. Okay, so you can see on all 3 of these, it's in the upper right-hand corner. This one's in the lower right, lower left. This one's a little bit different because we've got more of a horizontal breakup of the space. I'm kind of leaning towards, I can't decide which one of these figures is the focal point. I guess the red jumps out at me a little bit more. And it's off center. It's not exactly to that point, and that's the thing. It doesn't have to be exactly on one of those points, but it generally needs to be off center. So if you'll notice this, what we call the ground plane and the sky plane. The ground plane here is taking up approximately 1/3 of the frame. Since the trees have more visual interest than the snow, the photographer gave them 2/3. Okay, so the photographer made a conscious choice to position himself or herself where the horizon was low enough that it could give 2/3 to the more visually interesting than to the less interesting. Well, I mean, I don't want to say less interesting, but you know what I mean. Here's one that's a little bit more symmetrically balanced. You've got well, it's kind of interesting because you've got this horizontal line that almost slices through the middle, but then the way the banding is working in this frame, it's like almost 1/3 to the blue, and then almost 1/3 to the orange, and then almost 1/3 again to the blue. The boat's a little bit off center here, but I think generally it, in my opinion, looks better right here. It is kind of hitting on the rule of thirds here, and this time the artist has taken the horizon line and very specifically placed it on the third point. And then the thing that's interesting, at least to me, is that you do still have a secondary horizontal break, because you have your orange come about to the halfway point, and then the blue takes up the other half. You know, so these are interesting things to think about and look at. And then here's another one where instead of emphasizing the water, the artist emphasized the sky. And so, you know, and so I'm gonna have you do some activities, exercises where you, you know, either have an actual horizon or some kind of some kind of horizontal breakup of space. Here's a really good example of an almost symmetrical. You know, we don't usually want to do symmetry, but sometimes it's good. And a lot of times if we do symmetry, it's nice to have it just a little bit off. You know, this is close to symmetrical, but the center point is moved a little bit to the side, and the bulk of the visual weight, you've got your blue right here. This really does, with the central point off center, does kind of break it up into an approximate 2/3, 1/3 vertical. Okay, let me see what else we got in here. You guys have to read all this, not just looking at the pictures while I talk about them is not enough. I hope you know that. Let's see here. But I thought that these were all kind of excellent articles. So how to use balance in photography. Let's take a look at this one. Okay. You know, more just about you know, balance. You have one assignment where you're supposed to have that horizon or whatever kind of horizontal divider going through the horizontal center of the image, and it can be super symmetrical like this, where you've got an almost exact copy of the top half of the frame to the bottom half. It doesn't have to be. It could also be something like, you know, the picture we were just looking at of the sailboat. But if you want kind of what we would call an absolute symmetry, one thing that you do often see is you know, shots of a lake. You know, a landscape on a lake, and it's real still. There's no wind. There's no movement in the water, and so whatever is on the, you know, whatever is on the ground is being reflected upside down in the water, and those can be quite striking. Okay, it's another interesting the way that this is using almost 1/3 here, almost a 2/3. But here's another thing that I want to point out. Okay, clearly I don't have to tell you what the focal point is, right? The focal point is the action. Okay, your eye should be just completely drawn immediately to the boy on the skateboard. A number of reasons. He's contrasting against the wall. He has some diagonals in him. Diagonals are dynamic. They make your eye move, and we are always moving in diagonals. So there's a diagonal there. I wish that this Facebook thing would stop popping up when I try to point. I'm sorry about that. You know, another diagonal there and another diagonal there. Um, this is also a directional device. The perspective, which we're going to talk about next week, the linear perspective, but let's go ahead and look at the way that the lines appear to be converging. If you took these lines and carried them all the way out until they all touched, they would all touch right here. So this is very, very intentional. The artist has set up the artist has set this up so that you know, you've got additional emphasis bringing your eye to the focal point. Okay, here's a nice example of a vertical, you know, rule of thirds. Okay. You know, another thing that we can do is sometimes throw off the balance a little bit for expressive effect. Sometimes if you want to make the viewer feel a sense of maybe a little bit discomfort, a little bit unsettling, and if something's out of balance, it makes us kind of literally feel a little bit out of balance because we depend so much on our eyes for our stability. And so sometimes you can kind of try to violate that rule of thirds a little bit, or the rule of, you know, balance and symmetry, and maybe make something that seems a little top heavy, or make something that seems a little bit, you know, heavier on the left side than on the right side, or whatever. I think this one is just really interesting because it's a very, very interesting breakup of space. It's kind of confusing as to where the visual weight is, and it's kind of dizzying. And I think that's the effect that the photographer was looking for. You know, that this is, you know, I think you would be feeling a little bit unbalanced if you were actually standing there looking at this. And so, you know, that's a good example. Okay, very nice, kind of a rule of thirds there. Using depth of field to get rule of thirds. And you know, I'm going to let you guys make your own choices on this stuff this time, but you know, I want your focal point to stand out, and that means it needs to be emphasized. You know, what we call emphasis and subordination, where the focal point is emphasized and the rest of the picture is important, but it's there to support the focal point, and therefore it's subordinate. And so a really good trick to use, especially if it's a very busy background like this, use a big aperture so that you can have a shallow depth of field. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, let me just, you guys can read that for yourself. Let me just see if there's anything in these other, I've got two more I want you to look at. Yeah, just, you know, I mean, they're all kind of saying the same thing, but showing you very, very different ways. You know, this is a beautiful example of a really, really minimal composition. It's almost all pure white. And so what little there is other than snow in this image is dark. And they're very small, but there's so much contrast that these little tiny things have enough visual weight to balance out with this big open space. And so, you know, one of the visual weight rules is that something that is small and dark can be heavy enough to balance out with something that is big and light. Also, something that is patterned or busy can be small and be balanced out with a large, you know, plain empty area or nearly empty area. You know, so those are kind of things to look at. I'm trying to just get all the different ways that we could possibly, you know, break up the space. And so you're going to have, you know, assignments for, you know, using line, using color, using some kind of contrast to devise your focal points. You're also going to do a just brought to mind. You're also going to do a panorama this week. I'll explain that in a little bit, and I'm going to have tutorials for you and all of that. But to get a picture like this, probably what the photographer did was they were probably standing kind of right here, and they pivoted on their feet to where they were, pointed over in this direction. They probably took a shot, like say right around in this space. And then without moving their horizon line, rotate their shoulders and their body without moving their feet a little bit, and take the next shot and make sure that it kind of would overlap. Okay, do the same thing. This is probably 4, maybe 5 different frames that are stitched together. Okay, and you would not believe how easy it is to put these together into a fantastic panorama in Photoshop. It's almost too easy. It's almost too easy to, but it's so gratifying. So I'm going to have you do one of those, and I'll have some videos for you. This is good because it's not using photographs to explain some of these principles of balance and symmetry, and it's got photographs too, but I always like it when there's kind of a little diagram like this to kind of help you understand what visual weight means, what balance means. You have an assignment where you're going to have a perfect symmetry, and this is like not exactly absolute, but it's pretty close, to absolute mirror image on either side. I kind of had that one in mind when I was making up the excellent example of using a shallow depth of field to get your eyes focused on the focal point. Okay, let's see what else. I know this is a lot, but the way I see it, the more examples you have, oops, I already did that one, sorry. The more examples you have, the better off you'll be. There's not a whole lot of reading involved. It's mostly looking at pictures, so I don't feel too bad about it. Here's a great example of, something that, a plain background, but it's balanced by this smaller thing because A, there's a lot of contrast, B, this is a very complex form. Okay, so say something like a star shape or a flower shape, it can be small and carry more visual weight than say a simple circle or a square because it's more complex. Okay, central composition. I generally don't care for photographs of people right down the center. I mean, sometimes there's reason to do it, but a lot of times it just comes out looking like a mug shot. And I really think, and I hope you would agree with me, that this picture looks a lot better, moved off to the side. Oh, this is by that guy that wrote that book that I had you guys read, or that I asked you to read. Okay, let me point out some of the videos here. We're going to start working with Photoshop this week, and I'm going to be adding a few videos that aren't already here at the time of this screen recording. But what you're going to need to do is practice a lot. Okay, Photoshop is a lot of fun to use. It is a big learning curve at the beginning, and I'm not, and this is a photography class, we're not doing a lot of composite images or anything like that, so really the things that you'll be doing in here aren't all that different from what you did in Lightroom in terms of adjustment. The thing about Photoshop is it gives you a lot more control over isolating certain areas and adjusting them so that, say, well, the foreground's a little dark, but the background looks good. You can mask out the background and edit just the foreground. This is a great place to start for those of you who've never used Photoshop before. And I just put a whole bunch of, Photoshop things. I'm gonna have another video for you on using panorama. I'm going to have a video specifically on using refine edge and specifically using masking. So just look for me to be adding a few more of these. The rest of these right now are just kind of more um, rule of thirds videos. Okay, so hopefully this will all make sense. In the to do this week folder, I think you guys have already taken the quiz. But I'm primarily going to focus on this activity where you're going to do composition and balance, and I will come back to this in another video and give you some instructions on this. So go ahead and do your reading and do your video watching and do be practicing with Photoshop, and then come back to this assignment and I'll have another video for you.